On a day in February, AD 638, Caliph Omar entered Jerusalem atop a white camel. His garments were tattered and dirty, and the soldiers accompanying him were rugged in appearance. Yet their discipline was flawless. Walking beside him was Patriarch Sophronius, the chief magistrate of the newly surrendered city. Omar made his way directly to the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, the very place from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended into heaven. As Sophronius observed him standing there, he recalled the words of Christ and whispered through tears, "Behold the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Afterward, the Caliph requested to visit the Christian holy sites. The Patriarch led him to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and guided him through its sacred spaces. While they were still inside, the time for Muslim prayer approached. Omar asked where he might lay down his prayer rug. Sophronius urged him to remain where he stood, but Omar chose instead to step out onto the porch of the Martyrion. He explained that he feared his devout followers might later lay claim to any place in which he had prayed. His caution proved justified. This arrangement followed the conditions set for Jerusalem's surrender. The Prophet Muhammad had declared that while pagans must choose between conversion and death, the people of the book were permitted to maintain their places of worship and practice their faith freely. However, they were not allowed to build new houses of worship, bear arms, or ride horses. They also had to pay a special head tax, the jizya. Sophronius had likely hoped for no better outcome when he ventured out on a donkey under a guarantee of safe conduct to meet Omar on the Mount of Olives, refusing to surrender the city to anyone of lesser rank. Jerusalem had endured a siege lasting over a year. The Arabs, untrained in siege tactics and lacking proper equipment, had failed to breach the city's newly restored defenses. But inside the walls, supplies were dwindling, and no help was expected. The surrounding lands were under Arab control, and town after town in Syria and Palestine had already capitulated. No Christian army remained within reach except the garrison at Caesarea, which held on with the aid of the imperial fleet. Beyond the usual surrender terms, Sophronius secured only a promise that imperial officials in the city could leave safely with their families and belongings, retreating to the coast at Caesarea. This marked the final public act of the Patriarch. From his youth, traveling among Eastern monasteries with his companion John Moscus to collect the sayings and stories of the saints for the spiritual meadow, to his reluctant acceptance of the bishopric of Jerusalem under an emperor whose policies he opposed, Sophronius remained a tireless opponent of heresy and divisive nationalism. He had strived to prevent the fragmentation of the empire. Yet, despite being known as the honey-tongued defender of the faith, his efforts ultimately failed. The Arab conquest was a bitter confirmation of this defeat. A few short weeks later, Sophronius died, his heart broken. No human intervention could have prevented the unrest that erupted in Rome's eastern provinces. A long-standing, underlying tension between East and West had marked the history of the Roman Empire. Although the West triumphed at Actium, it was the East that eventually gained the upper hand over its victors. Provinces like Egypt and Syria stood out as the wealthiest and most densely populated in the empire. They were the empire's industrial heartlands, their ships and trade caravans managing the flow of goods from the East. Their level of cultural development surpassed that of the West, not only because of their ancient traditions, but also due to the cultural stimulation provided by their proximity to Rome's only true rival in civilization, the Sassanid Persian Empire. As time passed, the East's influence continued to rise. Eventually, Emperor Constantine the Great embraced an Eastern religion and relocated the imperial capital to Byzantium on the Bosphorus. In the following century, when internal decay left the empire vulnerable to barbarian invasions, the West collapsed, but the East endured. As new barbarian kingdoms emerged across Gaul, Spain, Africa, remote Britain, and ultimately Italy, the Roman emperor continued to govern the East from Constantinople. Historically, the Roman administration had rarely been popular in Egypt and Syria. However, resentment toward the government in Constantinople grew even more intense. Much of this animosity stemmed from external factors. The economic decline of the West meant fewer markets for Syrian traders and Egyptian artisans. Ongoing wars with Persia disrupted the desert trade routes linking Antioch to the cities of Lebanon. Soon after, the collapse of the Abyssinian kingdom and turmoil in Arabia severed Red Sea trade routes once dominated by Egyptian sailors and caravan leaders from Petra, Transjordan, and southern Palestine. As Constantinople rose to become the empire's chief commercial hub, long-distance trade, encouraged by imperial diplomacy, shifted toward a more northerly path through the steppes of Central Asia. This shift was deeply resented by the merchants of Alexandria and Antioch, who felt increasingly overshadowed by the imperial capital. Their bitterness deepened as the government moved toward greater centralization. Local rights and freedoms were steadily reduced, while tax collection became more aggressive and burdensome than it had been under earlier Roman rule. This climate of discontent reignited Eastern nationalism, a force that never remained dormant for long. Religious conflict eventually brought this simmering struggle into the open. Under pagan emperors, local religious traditions were often tolerated. It was easy to incorporate regional deities into the Roman pantheon. Only the unwavering monotheism of Jews and Christians occasionally provoked persecution. However, Christian emperors could not afford such tolerance. Christianity, by nature, demands exclusivity, and the emperors saw it as a tool to unify their diverse subjects under a single spiritual and political order. Although Constantine was not deeply versed in theological matters, he tried to unify the church during a time when it was divided by the Arian controversy. 50 years later, Emperor Theodosius the Great went further, making religious conformity a cornerstone of imperial policy. But unity was elusive. The East embraced Christianity with great enthusiasm. Greek intellectual traditions brought a love of intricate theological debate, while Hellenized Easterners added a passionate fervor that often turned into intolerance and fanaticism. The central issue in these disputes was the nature of Christ. While theological in nature, these arguments captivated the general public, who treated religious debate as a favorite pastime, second only to the spectacles of the circus. There were deeper social tensions at play as well. Many ordinary Syrians and Egyptians preferred a simpler form of worship and were repelled by the elaborate ceremonies of the Orthodox Church, which they viewed as excessive, especially in light of their growing poverty. Furthermore, they saw the Orthodox clergy as representatives of the imperial authority in Constantinople. Even among the upper clergy, resentment festered. The patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch were outraged to see the relatively new bishop of Constantinople elevated above them in rank. Given this volatile mix of cultural resentment, economic hardship, centralized oppression, and ecclesiastical rivalry, it was perhaps inevitable that religious dissent would arise. And when it did, it took on the character of a nationalist and divisive movement. Arianism quickly faded in the East, surviving only in Abyssinia, but the theological disputes of the 5th century proved to be far more enduring. Early in that century, Nicephorus, a Syrian-born patriarch of Constantinople, introduced a doctrine that placed excessive emphasis on the human nature of Christ. This line of thinking had long been favored by theologians of the Antiochene school, and Nicephorus gained considerable support in northern Syria. However, his views were officially condemned as heresy at the Council of Ephesus in 431. As a result, numerous congregations in Syria broke away from the church. Outlawed within the Roman Empire, the Nestorians relocated their base to Mesopotamia, within the domain of the Persian king. From there, they focused their efforts on missionary work further east, reaching as far as India, Turkestan, and even China. Yet during the 6th and 7th centuries, they continued to maintain a presence in Syria and Egypt, primarily among merchants involved in Easter trade. The controversy surrounding Nestorianism eventually led to an even more divisive conflict. Triumphant over both the Antiochene theology and a rival patriarch of Constantinople, the theologians of Alexandria swung too far in the opposite direction. They advanced a doctrine that appeared to negate Christ's humanity altogether. This belief, initially proposed by a relatively obscure priest named Eutyches, came to be known as Monophysitism. In 451, it was condemned by the Council of Chalcedon, the fourth of the ecumenical councils. In response, the Monophysites severed ties with the main body of the Christian Church. Most Egyptian Christians and a significant number of Syrian congregations sided with the Monophysites. The Armenian Church, whose representatives arrived too late to participate in the council's discussions, also rejected the council's decisions and aligned themselves with the Monophysite cause. Subsequent emperors made repeated efforts to heal the rift, seeking a theological formula that could reconcile the divisions and receive the endorsement of another ecumenical council. However, two major obstacles stood in their way. First, the dissenters were not eager to rejoin the church unless it was on terms that Orthodox leaders found unacceptable. Second, the Roman Church, led by the Pope, strongly opposed any compromise. Pope Leo I, believing it was the duty of the Bishop of Rome to define doctrine, dismissed the intricate theological debates that he struggled to grasp. He issued a straightforward and definitive declaration of orthodoxy, known as the Tome of Leo. Although the document did not address the complexities of the controversy, the Council of Chalcedon adopted it as the foundation for its conclusions. Pope Leo's position was simple and inflexible, leaving no room for nuanced interpretation. Any concession to the dissenters would have required rejecting the Pope's formula, thereby causing a break with Rome. For emperors with political ambitions in Italy or the Western world, such a schism was unacceptable. Trapped in this difficult position, the imperial administration failed to develop a clear or consistent strategy. Instead, it alternated between suppressing the heretics and attempting to win them over. Meanwhile, heretical movements grew stronger in the eastern provinces, bolstered by the resurgence of local nationalist sentiment among eastern peoples. In addition to the Nestorians and Monophysites, another group in the East posed continual challenges to imperial authority: the Jewish communities. Jews were present in substantial numbers in many major cities across the region. While they faced legal restrictions and were occasionally subjected to violence or property damage during riots, they responded by exploiting any opportunity to harm the Christian population. With their significant financial resources and vast international connections, they were viewed as a persistent and potentially dangerous threat to the state. During the 6th century, conditions in the eastern provinces deteriorated further. Justinian's military campaigns in the west dragged on, draining resources and proving expensive. These conflicts complicated his religious agenda and brought heavier taxes upon the east, without offering any tangible benefits in return. Syria was particularly hard hit. Along with bearing increased fiscal pressure, it endured a string of devastating Persian raids and a series of catastrophic earthquakes. Amid this turmoil, only the heretical movements seemed to thrive. In Syria, the Monophysite community was galvanized into a strong and organized church by Jacob Berdius of Edessa, with crucial support from Empress Theodora. From that point on, the Syrian Monophysites were commonly referred to as the Jacobites. In Egypt, the Monophysites made up nearly the entire native population. Meanwhile, the Nestorians, who were firmly established beyond the Persian border and expanding rapidly eastward, solidified their influence even within the empire. Outside of Palestine's urban centers, Orthodox Christians became a minority. Derisively called the Melkites, they owed their survival to the strength and authority of the imperial government. In 602, a centurion named Phocas seized control of the imperial throne. His reign was marked by brutality and mismanagement. While Constantinople suffered under his tyrannical rule, the provinces descended into chaos, with civil unrest fueled by the rivalries of urban circus factions and deepening divisions among religious sections. In Antioch, the Jacobite and Nestorian patriarchs openly convened a joint council to coordinate efforts against the Orthodox Church. Phocas retaliated by dispatching a military force that massacred large numbers of heretics, aided enthusiastically by the local Jewish population. However, 2 years later, the Jews themselves revolted and executed the Orthodox Patriarch of the city in a violent uprising. In 610, Phocas was overthrown by Heraclius, a young nobleman of Armenian heritage and the son of Africa's provincial governor. That same year, the Persian king Khosroes II launched a full-scale invasion aimed at dismantling the empire. The ensuing conflict lasted 19 years. For the first 12 years, the empire was forced into a defensive stance. One Persian army swept across Anatolia, while another overran Syria. Antioch was captured in 611, followed by Damascus in 613. In the spring of 614, Persian general Sharbaraz advanced into Palestine, plundering the countryside and setting churches ablaze. The only church spared was the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, due to a mosaic above its entrance that portrayed the Magi in traditional Persian attire. On April 15th, Sharbaraz laid siege to Jerusalem. Although Patriarch Zacharias was ready to surrender the city peacefully to prevent bloodshed, the Christian citizens refused to concede. On May 5th, with the assistance of Jews from within the city, the Persians breached the defenses. What followed was a scene of immense horror. With homes and churches engulfed in flames, Christians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Reports claimed 60,000 were killed, and an additional 35,000 were enslaved. The city's sacred relics, including the true cross and the instruments associated with the Passion, had been concealed but were eventually discovered. They were taken, along with Patriarch Zacharias, and sent east as a tribute to the Christian queen of Persia, Miriam, who was a Nestorian. The destruction inflicted on Jerusalem and its surrounding areas was so extensive that even centuries later, the region had yet to fully recover. 3 years after their conquest of Jerusalem, the Persian forces advanced into Egypt and swiftly secured control within a year. Meanwhile, their northern campaigns brought them all the way to the Bosphorus. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The involvement of the Jewish population in the city's fall left a lasting mark, with memories of their role remaining bitter and unforgiven. The conflict with Persia increasingly took on the character of a religious war. When Emperor Heraclius finally gained the strength to counterattack in 622, he dedicated himself and his army to God, embarking on a campaign as a Christian warrior against the forces of darkness. Later generations would regard him as a precursor to the Crusaders. Indeed, William of Tyre, in his History of the Crusades written centuries later, included the Persian conflict in his account. In fact, the Old French translation of his work was titled The Book of Heraclius. Heraclius's campaign ultimately proved victorious. After numerous setbacks and moments of despair, he delivered a decisive blow to the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh in December 627. In early 628, King Khosroes was assassinated, and his successor sought peace. Although formal peace was not concluded until the following year, the empire eventually regained its lost territories. In August, Heraclius returned to Constantinople in triumph. The next spring, he traveled south to receive the Holy Cross and ceremoniously returned it to Jerusalem. Interestingly, under Persian rule, Eastern Christians had not suffered greatly. Khosroes, after initially supporting the Jews, had soon turned against them and expelled them from Jerusalem. While his court favored the Nestorians, he maintained an official policy of tolerance toward both the Monophysites and the Orthodox. Their churches were rebuilt and restored, and he even sponsored a council in his capital, Ctesiphon, aimed at reconciling the different Christian sects. However, the restoration of imperial authority soon revealed its bias toward the Orthodox Church. Once the initial joy of liberation faded, Syrians and Egyptians saw little benefit. Heraclius had inherited a bankrupt state and had funded his wars with significant loans from the church. The spoils from Persia were insufficient to repay this debt. As a result, heavy taxation resumed, with local populations once again watching their wealth flow into the hands of the Orthodox hierarchy. Heraclius's religious policies further alienated many. Although he harbored no deep-seated hostility toward Jews, his attitude changed after learning of their involvement in the Persian invasions. Influenced perhaps by an old prophecy about a circumcised people bringing ruin to the empire, he ordered the forced baptism of all Jews within imperial territory. He also urged Western rulers to do the same. While the decree was largely unenforceable, it inspired Christian zealots to commit violent acts against Jewish communities, intensifying Jewish resentment of imperial authority. The emperor then turned his attention to theological reconciliation. Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, himself of Syrian Monophysite origin, developed a doctrine intended to bridge the divide between Monophysites and Orthodox believers. With Heraclius's backing, this new doctrine was promoted across the empire following the end of the Persian War. Despite support from the Patriarch and the cautious endorsement of Pope Honorius, it gained little traction. The Monophysite leadership rejected it outright, and many Orthodox believers, led by spiritual figures such as Maximus the Confessor in Constantinople and Sophronius in the East, also opposed it. Heraclius, driven more by zeal than prudence, attempted to impose the doctrine universally. Aside from imperial courtiers and small groups of Armenians and Lebanese Christians, his efforts found little support. In response to the growing rejection, Heraclius revised the doctrine. His ekthesis, issued in 638, presented the idea of monothelitism, which likewise failed to gain acceptance. This theological episode, unresolved until the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680, only deepened the division and confusion that plagued the Christian communities of the East. In 629, while Heraclius was in Constantinople receiving congratulatory delegations from distant lands like France and India, a letter is said to have reached him from an Arabian tribal leader. This man proclaimed himself as a prophet of God and urged the emperor to embrace his new faith. Similar messages were reportedly sent to the rulers of Persia, Abyssinia, and the governor of Egypt. However, this account is likely legendary. It is doubtful that Heraclius at that time had any real awareness of the momentous changes unfolding across the Arabian Peninsula. At the dawn of the 7th century, Arabia was home to numerous independent and often unruly tribes. The region was steeped in idolatry, with each locality worshipping its own deities. The most revered of all shrines was the Kaaba in Mecca, the leading trading hub. Yet idolatry was already declining. Missionaries representing Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism had been active in the region for some time. Zoroastrian influence had made headway only in areas under Persian political control, particularly in the northeast and later in the south. Jewish communities thrived in many Arabian towns, especially Medina, and had converted a number of Arabs. Christianity had the widest reach. Orthodox Christian communities existed in Sinai and Patria, while the Nestorians, like the Zoroastrians, were mostly found in regions protected by Persia. The Monophysites had established congregations all along the caravan trade routes, extending down into Yemen and Hadramaut. Significant desert-edge tribes, such as the Banu Ghassan and the Banu Taghlib, were entirely Monophysite. Arab merchants, who frequently traveled to cities in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, had many opportunities to observe the great religions of the neighboring civilizations. Within Arabia itself, there also persisted an ancient tradition of monotheism known as Hanif. At the same time, there was a growing pressure for expansion. The Arabian Peninsula's meager resources, which had become even more strained after the collapse of the Himyarite irrigation systems, could no longer support its growing population. Historically, desert peoples had often spilled over into neighboring fertile lands. It was in this setting that Muhammad's extraordinary leadership emerged. Born in the sacred city of Mecca, he belonged to the prominent Quraysh clan, though his own family was of modest standing. He had traveled widely, gaining exposure to other cultures and religions, and took a particular interest in Monophysite Christianity. However, he struggled to accept the doctrine of the Trinity, favoring instead the pure monotheism found in the Hanif tradition. The faith he developed did not completely reject Christianity, but instead offered a revised and simplified version that his fellow Arabs could more readily embrace. Muhammad's rise as a spiritual leader stemmed from his deep understanding of his people. Though intellectually far ahead of his peers, he shared their mindset, values, and instincts. His remarkable political acumen only enhanced his influence. Thanks to this blend of insight and skill, within a decade, he built an empire from nothing. When the Hijra occurred in 622, his support base was limited to his household and a small group of loyal followers. By the time of his death in 632, he had united Arabia under his rule, and his armies were already moving beyond its borders. The sudden ascent of charismatic leaders is not rare in the East, but their dominance often fades just as quickly. Muhammad, however, established a lasting system, anchored by the Quran. The Quran, believed by Muslims to be the divine word revealed through the Prophet, not only contains spiritual guidance and stories, but also offers a comprehensive framework for daily life, governance, and law. It was straightforward enough to be accepted by Muhammad's contemporaries and flexible enough to guide the vast empire his successors would create. Islam's enduring strength lay in its clarity: one God in heaven, one earthly ruler, and one unifying law, the Quran. Unlike Christianity, which preached peace yet often failed to realize it, Islam made no apologies for its militant approach. Even during the lifetime of the Prophet, Islamic forces had already begun targeting the Roman Empire's provinces, conducting small, largely unsuccessful raids into Palestine. With the rise of Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, a clearer strategy of expansion began to emerge. The Arabian Peninsula was fully brought under control, marked by the removal of Persian influence from Bahrain. An Arab force advanced through Patria along the caravan routes leading to southern Palestine, where they defeated the regional governor, Sergius, near the Dead Sea. They proceeded to capture Gaza after a brief siege. While the local population was treated with leniency, the garrison's soldiers became the first Christian victims of the Islamic sword. In 634, Abu Bakr was succeeded by Omar, who carried on the mission of territorial expansion. At the same time, Emperor Heraclius, still residing in northern Syria, began to understand the gravity of the Arab incursions. However, the empire was suffering from a severe shortage of manpower. The wars against Persia had drained its resources, and many military units had been disbanded afterward to reduce costs. The empire was gripped by a widespread sense of fatigue and despair, a common aftermath for both victors and vanquished following a prolonged and bitter conflict. Despite these challenges, Heraclius dispatched his brother Theodore, leading the troops from the Syrian province, to stabilize the situation in Palestine. Theodore confronted the two principal Arab armies at a place called Gabbatha, southwest of Jerusalem, where he was soundly defeated. With southern Palestine secured, the Arabs moved north along the trade route running east of the Jordan River toward Damascus and the Orontes Valley. Cities like Tiberias, Baalbek, and Homs surrendered without resistance, and Damascus fell after a short siege in August 635. Now deeply concerned, Heraclius managed with difficulty to send two additional armies southward. One force, composed of Armenian troops under Prince Vahan and a significant contingent of Christian Arabs, led by a sheikh from the Banu Ghassan, was dispatched alongside another under the command of Theodore Tritherius, composed of a mix of imperial forces. Upon hearing of their advance, the Muslims temporarily withdrew from the Orontes Valley in Damascus, retreating toward the Jordan River. Tritherius engaged the Muslim forces at Jabiya in the Horan region, but was defeated. Nevertheless, he managed to hold a defensive position near the Yarmouk River, just southeast of the Sea of Galilee, awaiting reinforcements from Vahan's army. On August 20th, 636, during a fierce sandstorm, the decisive confrontation unfolded. Although the Christian forces outnumbered their opponents, they were strategically outflanked. In a dramatic turn during the battle, the Ghassanid leader and 12,000 Christian Arab soldiers defected to the Muslim side. Their allegiance to Monophysitism, their deep resentment toward Heraclius, and months of unpaid wages had made betrayal an easy choice. This act of treachery sealed the fate of the conflict. The Muslim forces achieved a resounding victory. Both Tritherius and Vahan fell in battle, along with nearly all their troops. With this defeat, Palestine and Syria were left exposed to the advancing Muslim armies. When news of the devastating battle reached Heraclius in Antioch, he was overwhelmed by despair. He believed that divine punishment had come upon him for marrying his niece, Martina. Lacking both troops and funds to defend the province any further, he performed a solemn prayer service in Antioch's cathedral. Afterwards, he departed by sea for Constantinople, weeping as he left the coast and bidding a sorrowful farewell to Syria. The Arab forces rapidly swept through the region. Heterodox Christian groups offered little to no resistance, and the Jewish communities actively supported the invaders, even guiding them. Only the major cities of Caesarea and Jerusalem, along with the fortresses of Pella and Dara near the Persian frontier, organized any significant defense. In Jerusalem, upon hearing of the Arab victory at Yarmouk, Sophronius repaired the city's fortifications. As the enemy approached Jericho, he gathered the sacred relics of Christ and sent them under cover of night to the coast, bound for Constantinople, determined that they would not fall into Muslim hands once more. Jerusalem endured a siege lasting over a year. Caesarea and Dara held out until 639, though by that time they had become isolated outposts. Antioch, the principal city of the East, had fallen the previous year, and nearly the entire region was now under Muslim control. Meanwhile, the Arabs had brought about the downfall of Rome's ancient rival, Persia. Their victory at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 637 secured their hold on Iraq, and a subsequent triumph at Navan the following year gave them control of the Iranian plateau. Yazdijerd III, the final Sassanid king, fled to Khorasan, where he remained until 651. By then, Arab forces had reached his eastern borders, extending as far as the Oxus River and the mountains of Afghanistan. In December 639, the Muslim general Amr led a force of 4,000 men into Egypt. Since the end of Persian rule, Egypt had suffered from disorganized administration. Its current governor, Patriarch Cyrus of Alexandria, was both politically inept and morally compromised. A convert from Nestorianism, Cyrus was a staunch supporter of the emperor's monothelite doctrine, which he sought to impose on the resistant Copts. His rule was so deeply resented that Amr had little difficulty in finding local collaborators. In early 640, after a 2-month siege, Amr captured the key frontier fortress of Pelusium, where he was reinforced by additional troops from the Caliph. He then advanced to Babylon, Old Cairo, where Roman forces were concentrated. A confrontation at Heliopolis in August 640 forced the Romans to retreat into Babylon's fortified citadel, which held out until April 641. Meanwhile, Arab forces had taken control of Upper Egypt. Following Babylon's fall, Amr moved through the Fayyum, facing no resistance as the governor and garrison fled, and then proceeded toward Alexandria. By that time, Cyrus had been recalled to Constantinople, accused of having negotiated secretly with Amr. After Heraclius's death in February, his widow, Empress Regent Martina, found herself too politically vulnerable to organize a defense of Egypt. Cyrus was sent back with instructions to negotiate peace. In November, he met with Amr at Babylon and signed the treaty surrendering Alexandria. However, the political tides soon shifted. Martina was overthrown, and the new government disavowed both Cyrus and the agreement. Amr had already broken terms by launching campaigns into the Pentapolis and Tripolitania. Despite these complications, it was becoming increasingly clear that Alexandria could not be defended, with the rest of Egypt already under Arab control. The city surrendered in November 642. Yet hope briefly revived in 644 when news arrived that Amr had fallen out of favor and been recalled to Medina. A new imperial army was dispatched by sea from Constantinople, swiftly retaking Alexandria in early 645. The force then advanced toward Fustat, the new city founded by Amr near Babylon. But Amr returned to Egypt, defeating the imperial troops near Fustat. Their commander, the Armenian Manuel, retreated to Alexandria. disheartened by the complete apathy of the local Christian population, who showed no interest in the Roman effort to reclaim the province. He made no attempt to defend the city and instead sailed back to Constantinople. The Coptic Patriarch Benjamin subsequently handed Alexandria over to Omar. Egypt was permanently lost. By the year 700, Roman control in North Africa had collapsed under Arab conquest. Just over a decade later, they entered Spain. By 717, the Muslim empire stretched from the Pyrenees in the west to central India in the east, and its warriors were already laying siege to the walls of Constantinople. The Eastern Christians accepted the rule of their non-Christian overlords without much resistance. The idea that Byzantium might rise again, as it once did against the Persians, to reclaim the holy sites now seemed unrealistic. The Arabs, unlike the Persians, quickly built a powerful navy based in Alexandria, which allowed them to seize control of the seas from the Byzantines. On land, they maintained the upper hand for nearly 300 years. There seemed to be little hope of salvation coming from the Christian princes of Europe. Moreover, not all Christian groups would have welcomed such intervention. For many heretical sects, the arrival of new rulers brought relief and even joy. The Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, Michael the Syrian, writing 5 centuries later during the era of the Latin kingdoms, recalled the long-standing belief of his people that God, in his power, raised up the children of Ishmael from the south to free them from Roman rule. He described this deliverance as a great blessing. Similar views were expressed by the Nestorians. An anonymous Nestorian chronicler even wrote that Christians rejoiced under Arab rule, praying for its success and prosperity. The Coptic Christians of Egypt were more reserved in their praise. Their criticism focused less on the Arab religion or people and more on the harshness and deceit of the general Omar, whose governance was marked by cruelty and excessive demands. Even the Orthodox Christians, once they realized that the feared persecution would not come and that the taxes under Muslim rule were lighter than those of Byzantine rule, showed little desire to resist. A few highland tribes, such as the Mardawites of Lebanon and the Taurus Mountains, continued to fight. The Arab conquest ultimately solidified the status of the Eastern churches in their existing roles. Unlike the Christian Byzantine Empire, which had tried to enforce religious conformity across its population, the Arabs were willing to tolerate religious minorities, much like the Persians before them, as long as they belonged to the people of the book. Christians, along with Jews and Zoroastrians, were given the status of dhimmis, or protected peoples. Their religious freedom was secured through the payment of the jizya, initially a personal tax, but later seen as a substitute for military service. Another tax, the carriage, was imposed on land. Each religious community, or millet, operated with a degree of autonomy under its own spiritual leader, who was responsible for the community's conduct before the caliph's authorities. Each group was allowed to keep the places of worship they possessed at the time of the conquest. However, not all rules were strictly enforced. Muslims did appropriate some major churches, such as the Great Cathedral of St. John in Damascus, and many churches and synagogues were periodically destroyed. Still, numerous new ones were also constructed. Later Islamic scholars permitted the dhimmis to build their places of worship, so long as these structures were not taller than Muslim buildings and their religious sounds did not reach Muslim ears. Nonetheless, strict regulations remained. Dhimmis were required to wear distinctive clothing, were forbidden to ride horses, and could not publicly challenge Islamic customs. They were also prohibited from attempting to convert Muslims, marrying Muslim women, or speaking disrespectfully of Islam. Loyalty to the state was a constant expectation. The Millet system introduced a different perspective on the idea of nationality. In the Eastern world, nationalism had not traditionally been rooted in race, but rather in shared cultural heritage, geographic location, and economic interests. Under this new system, religious affiliation came to replace national identity. For instance, an Egyptian would not consider himself primarily as a citizen of Egypt, but rather as a Muslim, a Copt, or an Orthodox Christian, depending on his faith. His primary loyalty was to his religion or to his millet, This system favored the Orthodox Christians over the so-called heretical sections. They were still referred to as Melkites, or the emperor's people, and they continued to see themselves that way. Even though they were forced by circumstance to live under non-Christian rulers and follow their laws, they still regarded the Byzantine emperor as God's representative on earth and their true sovereign. Saint John of Damascus, who held a government post under the Caliph, always addressed the emperor as his lord and master, despite theological disagreements, referring to the Caliph merely as the emir. Similarly, Eastern patriarchs writing to Emperor Theophilus in the 9th century, though living under Muslim rule, continued to acknowledge the emperor in these respectful terms. The Byzantine emperors embraced this role. While they had no administrative control over Muslim territories, nor did the Patriarch of Constantinople hold authority over his eastern counterparts, the emperors still considered it their duty to care for the Orthodox living beyond their borders. In matters of war and diplomacy with the caliphs, the welfare of these Christians was always kept in mind. This was not a matter of direct governance, but rather a powerful and emotional expression of the belief that Christendom remained united and that the emperors symbolized that unity. In contrast, the heretical churches lacked any secular protector. They depended entirely on the favor of the caliph, which limited their influence and reduced their standing. Many of these sects had originally split from Orthodox doctrine in an effort to simplify Christianity for local believers. Islam, bearing many similarities to Christianity and enjoying the advantage of being the religion of the new ruling elite, became an appealing alternative to many of them. Although we have no exact records of how many Christians converted to Islam, it is clear that most converts came from the heretical groups rather than from the Orthodox Church. Within 100 years of the Arab conquest, Syria had become mostly Muslim, though the Orthodox population remained relatively stable. In Egypt, the Copts retained their presence a bit longer due to their wealth, but they too steadily lost ground. Ironically, while the Millet system helped preserve the heretical communities, it also made reconciliation and reunification with the Orthodox Church practically impossible. The spread of Islam in Syria and Palestine did not result from a massive migration of Arabs from the desert. The conquering armies were relatively small and primarily established a ruling military elite over the local populations. The demographic makeup of the region remained largely unchanged. Regardless of whether the local people converted to Islam or remained Christian, they gradually adopted Arabic as their common language. Today we refer to their descendants as Arabs, but in reality, they were a mix of many ancient peoples. Arameans had also slowly settled in the area over centuries. Among them were Jews who had joined the early Christian church, such as the first apostles. Only the Jews who continued practicing their religion maintained a clear ethnic identity, though even their lineage had been somewhat diluted over time. In Egypt, the population was more ethnically Hamitic, but it too became more mixed due to intermarriage with Syrians, desert tribes, people from the Upper Nile, and others from across the Mediterranean region. Arab settlement naturally became most concentrated in areas close to the desert and in the cities located along key caravan routes bordering it. With the decline of Mediterranean sea trade that followed the Arab conquest, these inland cities rose in significance, surpassing the Hellenistic cities situated nearer the coast. Alexandria was the only major Mediterranean port the Arabs continued to maintain. There, as well as in the Hellenistic cities of Syria, Christian communities remained strong, likely still outnumbering the Muslims. A similar pattern appeared in rural Syria. The inland plains and valleys increasingly embraced Islam, while the region between the Lebanon mountains and the coast remained largely Christian, with various sects present. In Egypt, the religious divide took a different form. The rural population, or fellahin, gradually converted to Islam, whereas the urban centers stayed predominantly Christian. In Palestine, religious distribution was less consistent. Much of the countryside became Muslim, but numerous villages continued practicing Christianity. Important Christian towns, such as Nazareth and Bethlehem, remained almost entirely Christian, and in Jerusalem Christians still made up the majority. Most Palestinian Christians belonged to the Orthodox Millet, In addition to them, there were also significant Jewish communities in Jerusalem and in smaller towns like Safed and Tiberias. Ramla, the newly established administrative capital, became the chief Muslim center. This general demographic arrangement in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt persisted for the next 4 centuries. Muawiyah, the 5th caliph from the Umayyad dynasty, had formerly served as governor of Syria. After becoming caliph in 660 CE, he established Damascus as his capital, where his descendants would rule for nearly 100 years. This period marked an era of prosperity for Syria and Palestine. The Umayyad caliphs, with only a few exceptions, were notable for their competence and relatively broad-minded tolerance. With the caliph's court based in the region, good governance was ensured, commerce flourished, and local culture was actively supported. The culture they found and fostered was primarily Hellenistic Christian, shaped by influences commonly associated with Byzantium. Greek-speaking Christians held positions in the civil administration, and for many years, government records were kept in Greek. Christian artists and craftsmen were employed by the caliphs. A prominent architectural achievement from this period is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed under Caliph Abdul Malik in 691. It stands as the most distinguished example of the rotunda style from Byzantine architecture. The mosaics adorning it rank among the finest works of Byzantine art. Debate remains as to whether these mosaics were created entirely by local artisans or with assistance from craftsmen and materials brought in from Byzantium by Walid. The mosaics were designed in strict accordance with Islamic rules forbidding the depiction of living beings. However, in their private countryside retreats, such as the desert hunting lodge of Qasr al-Amra beyond the Jordan, the Umayyads allowed frescoes featuring human figures, including nude forms. In essence, their reign did not halt the development of the Near East Hellenistic cultural tradition. Instead, it supported its last and most refined expression before it faded away. For a time, Christians had little reason to resent the rise of Islam. Apart from occasional episodes of persecution and some degrading restrictions, they generally fared better under Muslim rule than they had under the Christian emperors. Law and order were more consistently maintained, commerce thrived, and taxes were significantly lighter. Furthermore, for much of the 8th century, the reigning Christian emperor was an iconoclast. In such a context, devout believers often found greater religious freedom and peace under Muslim rulers. However, this favorable period did not last. The decline of the Umayyad dynasty and the internal conflicts that eventually brought the Abbasids to power in Baghdad in 750 plunged Syria and Palestine into disorder. Local governors, driven by greed and lacking oversight, seized Christian churches and forced congregations to buy them back. Periods of religious fanaticism followed, with waves of persecution and coerced conversions. Although Abbasid rule eventually restored order, a significant shift had occurred. The relocation of the capital to distant Baghdad weakened central control over the provinces. While caravan trade remained active, the absence of a major nearby market reduced economic vitality in the region. The Abbasids, unlike their Umayyad predecessors, adhered more strictly to Islamic principles and were generally less tolerant of Christian subjects. Although they too relied on older cultural traditions, these were rooted in Persian, not Hellenistic, heritage. The Abbasid capital stood in what had once been Sassanid territory, and Persians came to dominate many positions of power. Persian styles influenced both artistic expression and everyday life at the court. As under the Umayyads, Christians were still employed in administrative roles, but now they were mostly Nestorians whose cultural and theological orientation leaned eastward rather than westward. The Abbasids showed a keen interest in intellectual pursuits, often greater than that of the Umayyads. Nestorian scholars played a key role in translating Greek philosophical and scientific texts, and even scholars from Byzantium were invited to teach in Baghdad. Nonetheless, this engagement with Greek knowledge was relatively shallow. The core of Abbasid civilization remained grounded in the traditions of Mesopotamia and Iran. The only place in the Islamic world where Hellenistic culture truly survived was in Muslim Spain, where the exiled Umayyads had taken refuge. Despite these changes, Christians under Abbasid rule were not without comfort. Muslim writers like Al-Jaiz in the 9th century sometimes attacked them harshly, but primarily because of their wealth, confidence, and occasional disregard for legal restrictions placed upon them. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, writing to the Patriarch of Constantinople around the same time, remarked that the Muslim rulers are just and do us no wrong, nor show us any violence. This sense of fairness and self-restraint was often genuine. In the 10th century, for example, when Arab forces were struggling in their wars against Byzantium and Christian communities were attacked by angry mobs for allegedly supporting the enemy, the Caliph would ensure reparations were made for the losses they suffered. His actions were likely motivated in part by the resurgence of Byzantine power, especially as the Christian emperor now governed Muslim subjects of his own. The Orthodox churches, backed by foreign influence, continued to enjoy a relatively privileged status. In the early 10th century, the Nestorian leader Abraham III, during a dispute with the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, told the Grand Vizier that we Nestorians are loyal friends of the Arabs and pray for their victories, emphasizing that they had no allegiance to any foreign king, unlike the Greeks, whose rulers were in constant conflict with the Arabs. Nonetheless, it was a gift of 2,000 gold coins, more than any argument, that ultimately secured his victory in the dispute. The only Christian group consistently subjected to hostility were those of pure Arab descent. Those among them who refused to convert to Islam were forced to flee across the border and seek asylum in the Byzantine Empire. Christian migration into territories controlled by the Byzantine Emperor remained steady, and Muslim authorities did not attempt to stop it. There was never a consistent effort to prevent Christians inside and outside the Caliphate from maintaining close ties, even during times of war. Throughout much of the Abbasid era, the Byzantine Emperor lacked the strength to offer meaningful support to his fellow Christians. The failed Arab siege of Constantinople in 718 secured the survival of the Byzantine Empire, but it would take another 2 centuries before Byzantium could seriously counterattack the Arabs. Meanwhile, Eastern Orthodox Christians found a new ally in the emerging Carolingian Empire during the 8th century. As Charlemagne began expressing concern for the Christian holy sites, his involvement was warmly welcomed. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, eager to gain an ally against Byzantium, encouraged Charlemagne's efforts to establish religious institutions in Jerusalem and to send charitable gifts to the churches there. For a time, Charlemagne was seen as the protector of Orthodox Christians in Palestine, taking over a role once held by the Byzantine emperor. In gratitude, local Christians honored him with gifts and signs of respect. However, this support faded as Charlemagne's empire crumbled under his heirs and the Byzantine Empire experienced a revival. Frankish involvement in the region quickly diminished and was largely forgotten, apart from a few lingering traces, such as the Gust houses Charlemagne had established, the Latin services held in the Church of St. Mary of the Latins, and the Latin nuns who served at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Still, in Western Europe, the memory of this episode endured. Over time, stories and legends inflated Charlemagne's role, with claims that he had established legal rights over the holy places or had even made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. For future generations of Franks, their claim to authority in Jerusalem seemed both legitimate and divinely endorsed. Eastern Christians, however, were more concerned with the resurgence of Byzantine strength. In the early 9th century, the empire remained largely defensive, having lost territories like Sicily and Crete to Muslim forces. Arab raids into the heart of Asia Minor were a regular occurrence. By the middle of the century, thanks to the prudent fiscal policies of Empress Theodora, the Byzantine navy was restored and rearmed, allowing the empire to reclaim control over southern Italy and Dalmatia. In the early 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate began to collapse rapidly. Regional powers, such as the Hamdanids in Mosul and Aleppo, and the Ikhshidids in Egypt emerged. The Hamdanids were skilled warriors and devout Muslims, briefly acting as a barrier to Byzantine expansion. However, their involvement in internal conflicts only hastened the decline of Muslim power. Amid these struggles, The Crusades took control of Palestine and southern Syria, creating an opening the Byzantines quickly exploited. Initially cautious, Byzantine advances soon accelerated. By 945, despite the military efforts of the Hamdanid ruler Sef al-Dawla, the Byzantine general John Kirkuas had recaptured territories in Upper Mesopotamia that had not seen a Christian army in over 300 years. Progress quickened after 960 when the renowned General Nicephorus Phocas assumed command of the imperial forces. In 961, he recaptured Crete. A year later, he launched a campaign on the Cilician frontier, capturing Anazarbus and Marash, Germanisha, effectively isolating Muslim-held Cilicia. In 963, Nicephorus focused on domestic matters, orchestrating a successful coup that brought him to the throne. Returning east in 964, he completed the conquest of Cilicia and dispatched a force to Cyprus, reasserting full Byzantine control over the island. In 966, he led a campaign along the Middle Euphrates to disrupt communication between Aleppo and Mosul. These victories stirred hope throughout the Christian East. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, John, sent a letter urging Nicephorus to advance into Palestine. However, this act of perceived betrayal enraged the Muslim population. In response, John was arrested and publicly executed by burning at the stake. John's optimism proved to be premature. During 967 and 968, Nicephorus was occupied with affairs along the empire's northern frontier. However, in 969, he led his forces southward into the core of Syria. Advancing through the Orontes Valley, he captured and plundered the major cities of Shazer, Hama, and Homs, eventually reaching the outskirts of Tripoli on the coast. As he made his way back north, he left behind a trail of destruction, setting fire to Tortosa, Jabalah, and Laodike, while his commanders laid siege to Antioch and Aleppo. The historic city of Antioch fell in October, and Aleppo capitulated by the end of the year. In Antioch, where Christians likely outnumbered Muslims, the city was fully integrated into the Byzantine Empire. It appears that the Muslim population was forced to leave the area. Aleppo, predominantly Muslim, was turned into a vassal state. The treaty with its ruler clearly marked the boundary between the new imperial territory and the tributary cities. The ruler of Aleppo would henceforth be appointed by the Byzantine emperor. The state was required to pay significant taxes directly to the imperial treasury, from which Christians were exempt. Imperial merchants and trade caravans were granted special rights and protections. These humiliating terms seemed to signal the nearing collapse of Muslim control in Syria. Before Aleppo surrendered, the Emperor Nicephorus was assassinated in Constantinople by his wife and her lover, his cousin John Tzimiskes. Despite his military successes, Nicephorus was a stern and unpopular figure, disliked for his harsh taxation, corruption, and conflicts with the church. John, already renowned as a skilled general, had no trouble ascending to the throne. He reconciled with the church by distancing himself from his imperial mistress. However, a war with Bulgaria kept him occupied in Europe for the next 4 years. During this time, Islam experienced a resurgence under the Fatimid dynasty, which gained control over Egypt and southern Syria and even attempted to retake Antioch in 971. By 974, John was finally able to focus on the Eastern Front. That autumn, he launched a campaign into eastern Mesopotamia, capturing Nisibin and subduing Mosul, even briefly considering a bold march toward Baghdad. Yet he recognized that the Fatimids posed a greater threat than the Abbasids, and in the spring he redirected his efforts toward Syria. Following the same path that Nicephorus had taken 6 years earlier, John advanced through the Orontes Valley. Homs surrendered without resistance. Baalbek was taken by force, and Damascus offered tribute and pledged allegiance. Continuing into Galilee, he reached Tiberias and Nazareth before descending to the coast at Caesarea. Delegates from Jerusalem approached him, pleading for mercy to avoid a brutal sack. However, with many key Phoenician coastal cities still under enemy control behind him, John decided not to press onward to the Holy City. Instead, he moved northward capturing coastal towns one by one, with the exception of the heavily fortified port of Tripoli. As winter approached, the emperor had no choice but to suspend his campaign. On his return to Antioch, he secured and garrisoned the important mountain fortresses of Barzia and Sion in the Nozeri range. He then made his way back to Constantinople, but the campaign was never resumed. In January 976, he died suddenly. These conflicts had re-established the Christian empire as a dominant force in the East. With the liberation of Eastern Christians appearing within reach, these wars began to take on the character of religious crusades. Previously, battles against Muslims were largely considered routine defensive actions for the protection of the empire and were regarded as part of everyday life. Occasionally, Christian prisoners might be forced by zealous Muslim victors to choose between renouncing their faith or facing death, and their martyrdoms were respectfully commemorated. In the eyes of the Byzantine public, dying in battle against Muslim forces carried no more spiritual merit than falling in combat against fellow Christians like the Bulgars. The Church made no distinction between the two. However, both Nicephorus and John declared that the conflict had now become a holy cause, for the honor of Christendom, for the redemption of the sacred sites, and for the downfall of Islam. Already during imperial celebrations of victories over the Saracens, hymns were sung praising God for triumphing over them. Nicephorus was particularly vocal about presenting his military campaigns as Christian missions, possibly in an attempt to offset his poor relationship with the Church. He tried to persuade the Patriarch to endorse a decree declaring soldiers who perished on the Eastern Front as martyrs. But the Eastern Church, firm in its beliefs, would not condone killing as an acceptable path to sainthood. Still, in the inflammatory message he sent to the Caliph before launching his 964 campaign, Nicephorus portrayed himself as a defender of Christianity and even threatened to march to Mecca to establish Christ's throne there. John Simisis adopted similar rhetoric. In a letter recounting his 974 campaign to the Armenian king, he expressed a desire to liberate the Holy Sepulchre from Muslim desecration. He explained that he had spared the cities of Galilee from being looted due to their significance in Christian history. Reflecting on his inability to take Tripoli, he added that, had it not been for that setback, he would have continued on to Jerusalem to worship at its holy sites. Muslims, who had traditionally been more inclined to see warfare through a religious lens, had grown complacent. Alarmed by the Christian resurgence, they sought to reignite their own religious zeal. In 974, riots in Baghdad compelled the Caliph to declare a jihad, a holy war. It had appeared that the Holy Land might finally return to Christian rule. But the Orthodox Christians of Palestine would be disappointed. John's successor, Basil II, never had the chance to resume the southern campaigns. His reign was dominated by internal strife and a prolonged war with the Bulgarians, which demanded his full attention. Basil managed to visit Syria only twice. In 995, he reaffirmed Byzantine authority over Aleppo, and in 999, he led an expedition as far south as Tripoli. By 1001, he concluded that further expansion in the region would be futile. A 10-year truce was negotiated with the Fatimid Caliph, initiating a peace that would remain mostly undisturbed for more than 50 years. The frontier between the two empires was established, running from the Mediterranean coast between Banyas and Tortosa to the Orontes River just south of Caesarea Shazer. Though Aleppo remained nominally under Byzantine influence, the rise of the Murtisite dynasty in 1023 brought de facto independence. In 1030, the emir of Aleppo decisively defeated a Byzantine force. However, this loss was offset the following year when Edessa was successfully incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. The peace agreement was mutually beneficial for both the Byzantine Empire and the Fatimid Caliphate, as both powers were alarmed by the resurgence of the Abbasid Caliphate, now bolstered by Turkish adventurers from Central Asia. The Fatimid ruler, recognized by the Shia Muslims as the rightful caliph, could not risk a renewed assertion of Abbasid authority. Meanwhile, Byzantium regarded its eastern frontier as more vulnerable than the southern one. This fear of Turkish incursions prompted Basil II to annex the nearby Armenian provinces and eventually absorb the southeastern principality of Vaspurakan. His successors continued this strategy, and in 1045, the king of Ani, the primary Armenian ruler, surrendered his kingdom to the empire. The last remaining independent Armenian territory, the Principality of Kars, was integrated into the empire in 1064. The motivation behind these annexations was largely strategic. Past experience had shown that the Armenian nobility could not be trusted. Despite their shared Christian faith and mutual opposition to Muslim conquest, the Armenians were deemed heretics by Orthodox standards and often harbored greater animosity toward Byzantium than toward Muslim powers. Although cultural exchange and trade flourished, and many Armenians rose to prominence within the Byzantine administration, deep-rooted hostility persisted. Given Armenia's geographic position, it provided a direct route into Asia Minor. It would have been unwise for Byzantine military planners to leave such a vulnerable area beyond their control. However, from a political standpoint, the decision was less prudent. The Armenians deeply resented imperial rule. Though Byzantine troops guarded the frontiers, the internal population remained dissatisfied and potentially disloyal. Without their traditional local leadership, many Armenians became rootless and contributed to growing unrest within the empire. More far-sighted leaders might have avoided triggering the Armenian question, which introduced a disruptive and discontented minority into the empire's social fabric. While northern Syria had come under Christian rule, the Christians living in southern Syria and Palestine generally tolerated Fatimid governance. They experienced only one brief period of persecution under Caliph Hakim. Ironically, Hakim was the son of a Christian mother and had been largely raised under Christian influence. Yet around 1004, he turned sharply against his early upbringing. For the next decade, despite Byzantine protests, he issued harsh edicts targeting Christians. In 1009, he ordered the demolition of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, declaring that the annual miracle of the Holy Fire, celebrated there on Easter Eve, was nothing more than a deceitful illusion. By 1014, approximately 30,000 churches had been burned or looted, and many Christians, fearing for their lives, outwardly converted to Islam. The Jewish population also suffered similar treatment. However, it's important to note that Muslims were equally subject to the caliph's unpredictable persecution. Despite his oppressive measures, Hakim continued to employ Christian officials. In 1013, perhaps to appease the emperor, he permitted Christians to emigrate into Byzantine territory. The persecution ended when Hakim began to believe he was divine. In 1016, this claim was publicly affirmed by his associate Durazzi. Muslim outrage over this blasphemy far exceeded any previous Christian or Jewish distress. Hakim, now alienating Muslims, banned the Ramadan fast and the pilgrimage to Mecca while offering greater freedoms to Christians and Jews. In 1017, full religious freedom was restored. Around 6,000 of the recently converted Christians returned to their faith. In 1020, churches had their properties returned, including materials taken during their destruction, and the rule requiring distinctive clothing for Christians and Jews was abolished. Yet by this time, Muslim resentment against Hakim had reached its peak. Durazzi fled to Lebanon and founded the religious sect later known as the Druze, named after him. As for Hakim, he vanished in 1021, likely assassinated by his ambitious sister, Sid al-Mulk. His disappearance remains a mystery to this day. The Druze continue to believe that he will one day return. Following his death, control of Palestine briefly passed to Salih ibn Mirdas, the emir of Aleppo. However, by 1029, Fatimid rule had been fully re-established. As early as 1027, a treaty had been signed that granted Emperor Constantine VIII permission to oversee the restoration of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This agreement also allowed former apostates to return to Christianity without facing punishment. The treaty was renewed in 1036, though the actual reconstruction of the church was not undertaken until nearly a decade later. during the reign of Emperor Constantine IX. Imperial officials traveled freely to Jerusalem to supervise the project. Their presence was so prominent that it stirred resentment among Muslim residents and visitors, who felt that Christians had effectively taken over the city. The number of Byzantines in Jerusalem's streets led to widespread rumors among Muslims that the emperor himself had arrived. Meanwhile, a thriving colony of Amalfitane merchants operated in the city under the caliph's protection. These merchants declared their allegiance to the emperor in hopes of securing the benefits extended to his subjects. The strength of the Byzantine Empire served as a shield for local Christians. In 1047, the Persian traveler Nicephorus recorded seeing many Greek merchant ships docked in Tripoli's harbor and noted the local population's anxiety over a possible attack from the Byzantine navy. By the mid-11th century, Christians in Palestine were enjoying a period of relative prosperity and peace. Muslim authorities exercised a tolerant approach, and the Byzantine emperor remained attentive to their welfare. Trade between Palestine and Christian nations overseas flourished, and Jerusalem benefited immensely from the sympathy, wealth, and increasing number of pilgrims arriving from the West.